He was already moving when the hand came down. Officer Sandra Greer, 12-year veteran of the Millhaven Police Department badge number 4471, standing on a public sidewalk in the full glare of 3 live television cameras, broadcasting to 180,000 viewers across the metropolitan area, drew her right hand back past her shoulder and brought it forward with everything she had. The man she hit did not fall. He did not cry out, did not stumble backward, did not raise his hands in defense or anger. His head snapped left from the force of the blow, and then it came back to center, and he stood exactly where he had been standing before, which was exactly where he had the legal right to stand, which was a public sidewalk in a city that belonged to him as much as it belonged to anyone. His name was Marcus Webb. He was 57 years old, gray at the temples, broad across the shoulders in a way that spoke of a younger man who had not entirely disappeared. He wore a navy suit that was not expensive in the way that performs wealth, but expensive in the way that simply fits. The way a garment fits a man who has worn the same quality of clothing for so long it has become a second skin rather than a statement. He was not holding a weapon. He was not threatening anyone. He was standing on a sidewalk with a phone in his hand, and he had been doing that for approximately 44 minutes before Sandra Greer's hand connected with his face, and in 44 minutes he had broken no law and violated no ordinance and given no officer of any authority any reason whatsoever to lay a hand on him. He knew what was coming before it arrived. That was perhaps the most devastating part of it, the part that would later make courtroom observers go quiet when they watched the footage, because if you looked closely enough at his face in the half-second before impact, you could see that he had already decided not to move. Not because he was incapable of moving, not because he was frozen with fear, but because he had come to this sidewalk on this particular Tuesday afternoon for a reason, and the reason had not yet fully revealed itself, and he was patient in the way that only certain kinds of people learn to be patient, the kind of patience that is not passive but deliberate, the kind that costs something every single second it is maintained. 52 minutes earlier, Marcus Webb had been standing in the hallway bathroom of his daughter's house looking at himself in the mirror above the sink. He was not a vain man. He did not linger in mirrors. But this particular morning he had stood there longer than usual, not examining his reflection so much as taking stock of it. The way you take stock of a room you are about to leave, noting what is there, committing it to a kind of internal record. The gray at his temples had accelerated in the last 2 years. There were lines around his eyes that had not been there 5 years ago. He was, by any reasonable measure, a man who looked exactly like what he was, someone who had spent 30 years in rooms where the weight of other people's consequences pressed down on everything. He adjusted his tie, navy like the suit. He had not worn a robe today. His phone buzzed on the edge of the sink. He picked it up. "Grandpa." His grandson Nathan's voice came through the speaker, and there was worry in it that a 13-year-old tries to disguise as casual but cannot quite manage. "Are you really going to that protest?" "I am," Marcus said, and he checked his watch. "The Civics Project, Nathan. Remember, we talked about this. Police accountability reform, how democracy works when people exercise it. You cannot understand this from a textbook. You have to see it. But Mom said it might get dangerous." Marcus looked at himself in the mirror one more time. "Your mother is right that it might," he said carefully, "which is exactly why I want to document it. So you can see the truth with your own eyes, not the version that gets edited and packaged and presented to you after 3 different people have decided what you should think about it." He ended the call and stepped out of the bathroom. His daughter Darlene was in the kitchen, and she did not say anything when he came through. But the way she was holding her coffee cup, both hands wrapped around it like it might float away, said everything she had decided not to say out loud. She was 41 years old, and she had inherited his calm and his stubbornness in equal measure, and so she knew that saying anything would accomplish nothing, and so she said nothing, and that silence between them was its own kind of conversation. Marcus picked up his wallet from the counter. He opened it not to take anything out, but simply because it was a habit. A ritual the same way some men touch a lucky coin or a photograph. Inside, next to his driver's license, sat a plastic card with an official seal embossed at the top, and his photograph on the right side, and 5 words printed in blue beneath the seal that had the weight of the entire constitutional history of the United States behind them. United States Supreme Court, Justice Marcus A. Webb. He looked at it for a moment that was longer than he intended. Then he closed the wallet and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. Nobody at the protest needed to know. That was not the point of today. The point of today was to see what the system looked like when it believed nobody important was watching. The roll call room at the Millhaven Police Department's downtown precinct smelled on the morning of every protest day of stale coffee and the particular kind of tension that comes from a group of people who have been told to expect trouble and are trying to decide in advance how much trouble they are willing to make. The fluorescent lights above the rows of folding chairs gave everyone a slightly greenish pallor that made the whole room look like it was operating underwater. Officer Sandra Greer sat in the 3rd row with her arms crossed and her jaw set in the way that her jaw was almost always set, which was tight and slightly forward, as though she were bracing for an argument she had already decided to win. She was 41 years old and built like someone who had started working out to prove a point and never stopped. Her hair was pulled back with a precision that suggested she did not permit herself small imprecisions in any area of her life. Her eyes were pale and quick, the kind of eyes that move across a crowd the way a bird of prey moves across an open field, not looking at things so much as cataloging them, sorting them into categories of threat and non-threat with the speed of long practice. She had been on the force for 11 years. She had spent 9 of those 11 years on downtown patrol, which meant she knew every corner of the protest corridor, every alley exit, every shop doorway where people could take shelter, or from which they could throw things, every camera angle that the news crews preferred, and exactly which positions along the police line allowed an officer to act outside the frame. The precinct called her the Hammer, and the officers who used that word were not always complimenting her. In the row ahead of her, a junior officer named Kyle Reeves was checking the battery indicator on his body camera for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. He was 26 years old, 8 months out of the academy, and had not yet learned to mistake the performance of preparation for preparation itself. He checked the battery because he genuinely intended to use the camera and intended it to work when he used it. This was in the culture of his precinct, a distinction that was not always appreciated. Captain Bill Harmon stood at the front of the room with a coffee cup in one hand and a clipboard in the other, going through the protest day briefing with the practiced efficiency of a man who has given the same briefing 40 or 50 times and has long since stopped paying full attention to his own words. He was 53 years old and had accumulated the particular physical looseness of someone who was once fit and has since made peace with not being fit, which is different from the looseness of someone who was never fit. He had been captain of this precinct for 7 years, during which time 4 complaints against one of his officers had been filed, and 4 complaints had been closed without investigation, and these 2 facts were related. After Harmon finished the formal briefing and the room began to break up, Greer fell into step beside the junior officer she had been assigned to work the protest line with a quiet young man from the South Side named Reeves. She walked with the rolling forward momentum of someone who does not wait for the world to get out of her way. "These people do not actually want accountability," she said, not to Reeves in particular, but to the air in front of her, which happened to be where he was walking. "What they want is an audience. They want someone to watch them be angry. Our job out there today is to make sure they understand that having an audience does not mean having power." Reeves did not respond to this, partly because he did not entirely agree with it, and partly because he had learned that not responding was sometimes the most honest thing you could do. They reached the parking bay. Greer opened the passenger side door of the patrol vehicle and paused with one hand on the roof, and in the pause her right thumb moved across the edge of her baton. A slow back-and-forth stroke, almost rhythmic, like someone running a finger along the spine of a book they are deciding whether to read. It was something she did without appearing to notice she was doing it. "Listen," she said to Reeves, and her voice dropped into the register she used when she wanted something to sound like advice rather than instruction. People out there only understand one language. When you are working crowd control, you make sure they hear it. You do not give them an inch of uncertainty because uncertainty is what they look for. The moment they think you are not sure, they own the block. Reeves got into the driver's seat and said nothing. The protest corridor was 3 blocks east. As they drove toward it, Marcus Webb was parking his car 3 blocks to the west. Marcus parked on Clement Street, which was far enough from the demonstration that none of the news vans or police vehicles were visible, yet close enough that he could hear the first threads of chanting carried on the July air like something being unraveled from a larger sound. He sat in the car for a moment after he turned off the engine, not because he was hesitant, but because he was in the way that he was always precise about these things, making a mental note of what he was about to do and why. He had told his clerk, a meticulous young man named Daniel, that he would be observing the protest in his civilian capacity without announcing himself, and that he would check in by text message every 45 minutes. If a check-in was missed, Daniel had standing instructions to contact the Department of Justice emergency line and provide Marcus's last known location. This was not a plan Marcus had come up with on the fly. It was the plan of a man who understood risk clearly enough to take it with open eyes. He got out of the car and started walking. The air on Clement Street smelled of last night's rain still evaporating from the asphalt, which gave it a slightly metallic quality, and underneath that, the particular urban heat smell of a July afternoon in a dense city, exhaust and concrete, and something green and struggling from the narrow strip of trees along the sidewalk. Marcus breathed it in and walked at the easy, unhurried pace of a man with somewhere to be who is not in a hurry to arrive. He pulled out his phone and opened the camera, and as he walked, he began narrating quietly into the microphone in the tone he used when he was leaving detailed notes for himself rather than performing for an audience. "This is a Tuesday in July," he said softly, and his voice had the unhurried quality of someone who has been measured all his life and has found it suits him. "The demonstration today is in the 3rd block of Addison Avenue, organized by the Millhaven Coalition for Police Reform. The stated goal is to call for implementation of a city ordinance requiring independent oversight of use of force incidents. This is a First Amendment event. The organizers have all required permits. Nathan. When you watch this, I want you to understand that what you are seeing is the most fundamental mechanism of a democracy functioning exactly as it was designed to function. People who disagree with their government gathering in a public place saying so out loud. That is not disorder. That is the whole point." He paused as the first full sound of the protest reached him. The chants resolving from abstract noise into actual words, and he let the microphone catch it. As he turned onto Addison Avenue, he began taking in the scene with the attentiveness of a man who had spent 30 years reading rooms for a living. He saw immediately that the police line was positioned more aggressively than crowd control protocols typically required for a permitted demonstration of this size. The officers were not in dispersal formation, which was appropriate for a non-violent gathering. They were in a modified containment formation, which was appropriate for a confrontation that had already begun or was being actively anticipated. The baton grips were wrong for a protective posture. They were wrong in the specific way that experience teaches you to notice the way a doctor notices a patient's posture before a word is spoken, the way a judge notices when a witness's breath changes before they answer a difficult question. He noted this without alarm because noting things was what he did, and started recording it with his phone held at chest height pointed at the police line. 20 feet away, inside that police line, Kyle Reeves checked his body cam battery one more time. Full charge. He settled into his position, feeling the heat coming off the asphalt in waves, and watched the crowd the way his training instructed him to watch crowds, which was with attention rather than assumption. He noticed Marcus immediately. Not because Marcus was doing anything wrong, but because Marcus was doing something that drew the eye in the context of a protest crowd, which was absolutely nothing. He was standing still. He was not chanting. He was not carrying a sign. He was not talking to anyone around him. He was simply watching and recording, and there was something about the quality of his stillness that Reeves found himself unable to categorize quickly, which was unusual because in 8 months of patrol he had gotten reasonably fast at categorizing. 40 feet behind Reeves, Officer Sandra Greer was also watching Marcus. Her thumb moved across the edge of her baton. What happened in the next 11 minutes was not an accident, and it was not an escalation in the sense of something that began small and grew without anyone intending for it to grow. It was a decision made by a specific person executed step by step with the practiced efficiency of someone who has made similar decisions many times before and has never experienced a consequence that caused her to reconsider making them. Sandra Greer separated from the police line. She did not radio in her movement. She did not inform her commanding officer that she was leaving her assigned position. She simply stepped out of the line and walked toward Marcus Webb with the forward-rolling momentum of a person who has already determined the destination and is working through the formality of the journey. Reeves watched her go. He felt something in his chest that he would later describe in a deposition that would be quoted in 3 separate law review articles as the specific discomfort of knowing something is wrong before you can articulate what it is. He checked his body cam. The red light was steady. He kept his position, and he kept watching. Greer stopped in front of Marcus. She was close enough that he would have been able to smell the particular chemical soap that the department issued to its officers, underneath which was the human smell of a body that had been in the heat for 2 hours. Marcus did not step back. "Delete that footage," Greer said. Her voice was flat and carrying the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Not a request. A command delivered in the declarative. Marcus lowered his phone slightly but did not turn off the camera. His voice when he responded was entirely level, the voice of a man conducting a professional interaction rather than a confrontation. "Ma'am, I have a constitutional right to record police officers in a public space. That right has been affirmed in federal court in this circuit multiple times, most recently within the last 18 months. I do not care about your legal citations," Greer said. And she took 1 step closer, which brought her inside the distance that most people instinctively protect as their own. "What I care about is that phone going off, and you stepping back behind the barrier." "Now, I am on a public sidewalk," Marcus said, and his tone did not change in any measurable way, "and I have not crossed any barrier or violated any ordinance. If you have a specific legal basis for your request, I am happy to hear it." The exchange continued for 4 minutes, during which Greer demanded identification. Marcus provided his driver's license. Greer ran it through the system and found nothing, and Greer's frustration became with each exchange more visible and more searching, the frustration of someone looking for a door and finding that the wall has no doors. During these 4 minutes, Kyle Reeves did not move from his position, but his body cam recorded every word in audio that would later be described by a federal forensic specialist as exceptionally clear. No degradation, no ambient interference worth noting. Captain Harmon's voice came over Greer's radio, crackling in the heat. "Greer, status." Greer clicked her radio. "Dealing with a problem," she said. "Handle it," Harmon said, and his voice had the particular quality of a man who is watching something from a safe distance and wants it resolved without his hands getting dirty. "We cannot let civilians think they own the street out here today. Not with the cameras running." "Copy that," Greer said. Reeves heard the radio exchange. Both parts. His body cam heard it too. Marcus also heard it, though he gave no outward sign. He had spent 30 years in rooms where people said things they believed would not be remembered, and he had learned that everything is remembered by someone, and that the question is only ever whether the someone with the memory will have the standing and the will to make it matter. He watched Greer's right hand. It had drifted to the baton again. The thumb moved back and forth along the edge, and the motion was slower now than it had been when they started, more deliberate, which was not a sign of calming down, but of something hardening into resolution. He could end this. He could reach into his jacket and produce the small plastic card with the federal seal and 5 words, and he could watch Greer's face perform its rapid color changes, and he could walk away. The whole thing from production of credential to walking away would take approximately 45 seconds. He did not do this. Instead, he stood on the public sidewalk in the July heat and held his ground and let Officer Sandra Greer make the decision she had been moving toward since the moment she stepped out of the police line and in the news van. 30 yards away, the anchor leaned toward his producer and said very quietly, "Something is about to happen. Keep rolling," and the producer nodded and the camera stayed on. Greer's hand left the baton. It rose. The hand came down. The crowd had gone quiet in the half-second before it happened, the way crowds sometimes go quiet when the body registers something the mind has not yet processed, a collective animal stillness, every chant and shout and shuffling foot-stopping, as though someone had lifted a needle off a record. The air smelled of hot asphalt and news van exhaust, and the faint sweetness of someone's spilled lemonade from a cup that had tipped over unnoticed 3 feet to Marcus's left. And somewhere behind the police line a radio was crackling with static that nobody was attending to, and the afternoon sun was at the angle that put Greer directly in its path so that the silver of her badge threw a brief sharp light across Marcus's face in the fraction of a second before her hand arrived. The sound cracked, not the flat, dull sound of a blow absorbed by resistance, but the sharp, carrying sound of a strike delivered with full extension and the force of a body that has been coiled toward it. A sound that the microphone on the WKTN news camera would later be praised for capturing, with what the audio technician described as uncomfortable clarity. A sound that traveled through the summer air and hit the edge of the crowd and came back as a gasp from 100 throats at almost exactly the same moment. Marcus's head snapped left, then it came back to center. He stood exactly where he had been standing. His feet had not moved. His hands, one of which still held the phone with its cracked screen and its steadily blinking red recording light, hung at his sides at the same angle they had been hanging before. His face, to the extent that it showed anything at all, showed the expression of a man who had seen something he expected to see, and was filing it away with the same careful precision with which he filed everything. Greer's voice came immediately loud and carrying, performing for the cameras she was now acutely aware of. Assault on an officer. Everyone saw it. He is under arrest. She grabbed his arm and spun him. Marcus did not resist. He brought his hands behind his back with the quiet compliance of someone who has already decided that this particular battle is not the one he is fighting, and the handcuffs closed around his wrists with a metallic ratcheting that the body cam caught clearly, and the metal was cold against his skin in a way that was distinct and specific. The kind of cold that registers even in July heat, because it is not the cold of temperature, but the cold of restraint, of being physically limited by another person's decision. Officer assaulted Greer, announced into her radio, her voice steady and professional. Everything controlled the narrative being laid into the official record with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this before. Suspect in custody. Situation contained. Kyle Reeves, 20 feet away, watched the arrest and kept his body cam running and said into his own radio in a voice that was very careful and very precise, "Confirming arrest, I have visual." What his visual showed was not what Greer's radio call had described. His visual showed a peaceful man standing still on a public sidewalk. His visual showed a hand rising and falling, and a head snapping sideways, and a body that did not react with violence, but with the particular stillness of someone absorbing injustice rather than escalating it. His visual showed an arrest that was predicated on a lie, and the timestamp on every second of it was accurate to the millisecond, and Reeves knew what he had, and he knew what it meant, and he stood in the heat of the July afternoon with that knowledge sitting on his chest like something with weight. Marcus's phone lay on the sidewalk where it had fallen when the blow landed, screen cracked in a diagonal line from corner to corner. The red recording light was still blinking. The audio was still running. Nobody checked it. Nobody picked it up carefully. An officer bagged it as evidence without examining it, which meant that the 43 minutes of continuous recording it contained, including the audio of Harmon's radio transmission and Greer's voice in the moments before the slap went into an evidence bag and into a patrol vehicle and was driven to the precinct along with Marcus Webb, who was placed in the back seat and rode through the streets of Millhaven, looking out the window at the city with an expression that the officer in the front seat would later describe when asked as the most unsettling calm he had ever seen on a person in custody. The precinct booking room had the specific institutional smell of a place that is cleaned frequently and thoroughly and still never manages to smell clean. A background note of industrial bleach that the coffee machine's burnt output could not quite cover underneath, which was something older and more human that no cleaning product has ever been formulated to address. The fluorescent tubes above the booking desk flickered at the end of their useful life in a pattern so irregular it occupied a subliminal corner of the brain. Marcus Webb sat across from the booking officer and answered the questions he was asked. Name: Marcus Webb. Address: he gave his daughter's address where he had been staying. Occupation: attorney. Not a lie, also not the full truth. The booking officer typed it and moved on the way. Booking officers move through information they are processing rather than considering, and Marcus's photograph was taken against the white wall with the height markings on it, and his fingerprints were rolled in ink, and he was assigned to holding cell 3, which was at the end of the row and smelled slightly more aggressively of bleach than the others because it was closer to the cleaning supply closet. The cell was approximately 8 feet by 10 feet of cinder block and reinforced steel with a metal bench along one wall and a single fluorescent tube recessed behind a wire cage in the ceiling that gave the space a flat, shadowless light in which everything looked equally important and equally insignificant. The bench was cold through the fabric of Marcus's suit in a way that was again specific, not temperature cold, but institution cold. The cold of surfaces that have never been warm, that have no memory of warmth. Marcus sat on the bench with his back straight and his hands folded in his lap and looked at the far wall and thought. In the report room 2 floors up, Sandra Greer was building the lie with the careful, practiced efficiency of a person who has built similar structures before and knows where the load-bearing walls are. She typed without looking at the keyboard, which was either impressive or simply the product of having written enough reports that the words came automatically in the proper form. She felt threatened. The suspect refused to comply with lawful orders. When she attempted to secure the scene, he made aggressive physical contact first. She responded with necessary force. The report did not mention the slap. In the version she was creating, Marcus had swung first and she had defended herself, and the whole thing was entirely within departmental use of force guidelines. As she typed, her right hand moved between sentences in the small, unconscious way it had moved all day, reaching toward the edge of the desk, the way it would reach toward the edge of the baton, that slow back and forth stroke that was not a decision but a reflex. The body maintaining its habits even when the instrument of those habits was no longer there. The baton was in her equipment locker. Her hand kept looking for it anyway. Captain Harmon read the report and signed it without a lengthy examination. "Good work," he said. "Clean documentation. No issues." Greer left his office and walked down the hall past the holding cells without looking at cell 3 and went to the break room and poured coffee. An officer came through and told her she was trending on Twitter. Greer opened the app on her phone, looked at the views climbing, looked at the comments, put the phone face down on the table. "It is just the internet," she said to the empty room. "It does not mean anything." But her hand was not entirely steady when she lifted the cup. In the locker room, Kyle Reeves sat on the bench with his laptop open and his body cam footage playing on the screen and watched the slap happen for the 3rd time. The audio was as clear as it had been the first time. He put on his earphones and listened to Harmon's radio transmission again, and then Greer's response, and then the 11-second gap, and then the sound of impact. His partner, Rodriguez, came in, saw the screen, saw what was on it. "What are you doing?" Reviewing the arrest, Reeves said carefully. Rodriguez's expression did not change in any dramatic way. He simply looked at the screen with the studied neutrality of someone deciding how much to engage with something they have already decided not to engage with. And then He closed his locker. "You have been on the force 8 months," Rodriguez said. "You want to make it to 9, you learn when to see things and when to look the other way. That is not a criticism. That is how this works." Reeves did not respond. Rodriguez left. Reeves sat alone with the footage playing on the screen and the sound of it in his ears and the weight of it sitting on his chest. He did not close the laptop. The protest video was on Twitter within 6 minutes of the arrest. Not the slap, specifically, not yet, but the arrest itself, a black man in a suit being taken into custody on a public sidewalk, hands behind his back, calm in a way that read as either deeply frightened or deeply certain, and it was the uncertainty about which of those things it was that made people click play and then watch it again. The hashtag was organic the way the real ones always are. Nobody deciding what the organizing phrase should be, just people independently arriving at the same word formation, suited and silenced, or suit and badge, or simply the question that the internet loves most, which is the question of identity. Who is he? Who is this man? Because there was something in the quality of his stillness that read as story, as context, as something more than the frame that was visible. In the WKTN news van, producer Emily Rowe had been reviewing the raw footage from 3 camera positions for 40 minutes by the time she found the timestamp she was looking for. 4:17:43 p.m. camera 2, the angle that had been positioned to catch the police line and had instead by the specific luck of where a camera operator had chosen to point it in. The moment when something instinctive said, "Turn this way," caught the full unobstructed arc of Sandra Greer's hand from its lifted position, through its full extension and contact, and the head that snapped sideways and came back. She called Tom Whitfield over. Whitfield was the anchor. He had been on television for 19 years and had the particular professional smoothness of a man who had learned to be trusted on camera before he had fully decided whether he deserved to be. He watched the footage. His jaw tightened in the controlled way of someone managing an expression. Our initial broadcast, Emily said, stated that the protester had become aggressive and an arrest was made. We said he assaulted the officer. Whitfield said nothing for a moment. Our own footage shows she hit him first. If we correct the record tonight, Emily continued, we look like we broadcast a lie. If we do not correct the record, Whitfield said slowly, thinking through it even as he was saying it, and the truth comes out from somewhere else, and it will come out. We look like we chose the lie over the truth when we had the footage to correct it, sitting right here. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the frozen image on the monitor. Archive everything, he said finally. All raw footage, all camera positions, nothing deleted, nothing edited. We review it fully before we make any on-air statement. That is not a correction. That is not justice. But it is something. Emily nodded. Outside the van, social media continued its acceleration. 100,000 views became 500,000. The hashtag climbed. The question of who he was climbed alongside it. Captain Harmon watched the numbers from his office and took calls from the mayor's communications director and the police union's public affairs officer and the city attorney's after-hours emergency line, all of them asking variations of the same question. And his answer to all of them was the same. It will blow over. It always does. We have a clean report and an officer with 11 years of service, and the protest crowd will move on to the next thing by Thursday. He believed this, or he told himself he believed this, which is close enough to the same thing in the short term and very different in the long term. Marcus Webb had been in holding cell 3 for 4 hours and 17 minutes when he made his first deliberate choice about timing. The choice was to wait longer. He could have activated what his clerk Daniel called the protocol, the chain of emergency contacts that began with a call to the DOJ General Counsel's office and escalated from there in a sequence that would have resulted in federal agents at the precinct within the hour. He knew the chain. He had reviewed it twice before leaving his daughter's house. The fact that he had reviewed it was itself a kind of preparation. The preparation not of someone who expected to need it, but of someone who was honest with himself about the range of possibilities. He waited because every hour he sat in this cell was an hour the institution had to reveal itself completely, and he was by training and by temperament a man who preferred complete information to partial information, who understood that the interrupted process shows you only the beginning of a thing and not its full nature. The fluorescent tube above him hummed at a frequency that he noticed in the first 20 minutes and had stopped noticing by the end of the first hour, which is how the brain handles persistent irritants when it has decided there are more important things to attend to. The bleach smell had not diminished. The bench had not gotten warmer. Somewhere down the row, a man was having a conversation with himself in a low, continuous murmur that was not intelligible as words, but had the rhythm of someone working through something that troubled him. Marcus thought about the cases he had written opinions on in the last 2 years. He thought about the arguments he had heard in chambers, the briefs he had read, the specific language of the rulings he had shaped. He thought about what it meant to sit in a room like this and have no title, no credential, no resource, no one coming, and he thought about the particular quality of that experience, not abstractly, but concretely, because he was sitting in the room and experiencing the version of it that was available to him, which was not the hardest version of it, and he knew that, but was still the version that was real and present and happening to his body right now. In the locker room, Kyle Reeves was connecting his body cam to his laptop for the 3rd time. He had spent the last 20 minutes thinking about what Rodriguez had said, and the thinking had not resolved in Rodriguez's favor. He was not naive about what filing a contradicting report would mean for his career in this precinct. He was not unaware that the blue wall was real and had real structural power over the daily experience of a junior officer. He was 26 years old, and he had another 40 years of working life ahead of him, and he was trying to make a decision in a locker room about what kind of person he was going to be for those 40 years. He downloaded the body cam footage to his encrypted personal email. He included all metadata. He did not delete it from the departmental server. He sent a second copy to a personal cloud drive. He created a third backup on a USB drive that he put in his civilian jacket pocket. Then he sat in the locker room with his hands on his knees and breathed and felt the specific physical sensation of having made an irreversible choice, which is not the same as the sensation of having made the right choice, though sometimes they coincide. 3 floors below, Sandra Greer was finishing her second coffee of the evening when the booking officer came through the break room. He mentioned in the offhand way of someone conveying information that has no particular weight to it that they had a request from downtown for the full name and occupation of the guy in cell 3, the attorney from the protest. Greer did not immediately register why this mattered. She picked up the clipboard from the counter. Marcus Webb, attorney, 57. She pulled out her phone and typed his name into the search bar. A habit of curiosity, nothing more. People sometimes turned out to be interesting when you looked them up. She typed Marcus Webb, attorney Millhaven. The autofill suggested something else before she finished. It appeared below her partial search like a trap springing. Marcus Webb, Supreme Court Justice. Greer's thumb hovered over the screen for 1 second that felt longer than it was, and then she pressed it. The page loaded. Official government website. Seal of the United States Supreme Court at the top. The same seal that appeared on the card in Marcus's wallet, the card he had not shown her. His photograph in the center of the page. Judicial robes formal, the expression of a man who has consented to be photographed for an official record without consenting to reveal himself in the process. Below the photograph, his name and title and his record appointed 2 years ago, unanimous Senate confirmation, 30 years of civil rights law before the bench. Below that, a list of his notable rulings. The first one on the list was a case from 6 months ago. She read the case name. She read the brief summary beneath it. It described a ruling that had established new liability standards for officers caught on camera using unlawful force, specifically eliminating the qualified immunity protection that had historically shielded officers from civil claims in such cases. He had written that ruling. He had written the law under which she was now liable for what she had done to him. Greer's coffee cup came out of her hand the way things come out of your hands when the muscles that are holding them suddenly receive a different signal from the brain, not a decision to release, but a collapse of the instruction to grip, and the cup hit the break room floor and shattered, and the coffee spread across the tile, and she did not look at it, could not look at it, could not look away from the screen. And then her brain did something that brains do in moments of catastrophic recognition, which was replay involuntarily, without her consent or her desire. The moment that had brought her here, the feeling of her hand rising, the sound of impact. The specific and particular way that Marcus Webb's head had snapped left, and then come back to center, and the expression on his face in the aftermath, which she understood now for the first time, understood with a clarity that was almost physical in its unpleasantness. The expression of a man who had expected it, who had waited for it, who had known it was coming, and had stood there and let it come because he had a reason for letting it come that she had not understood, and was only beginning to understand now. Her right hand moved without her thinking about it. It reached toward her side, toward where the baton sat when she was in uniform, toward the instrument of the habit that had brought her here. The baton was not there. Her hand found nothing but the fabric of her civilian jacket, and that absence, that specific reaching toward something that was no longer available to her, was the most honest moment of her entire day. She whispered 2 words, and then she said them again, quieter, and the quiet second time was worse than the first because it was the voice of someone running out of air. The break room was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a radio from the dispatch room. Greer sat down on the floor among the broken ceramic and the spreading coffee, and she sat there for approximately 40 seconds before she got up, which is a long time to sit on a precinct floor, but the 40 seconds were necessary because her legs were not yet reliably under her. She found Harmon in his office. He was typing something when she came in. He was still not looking up when she said the name, Marcus Webb. "Clean record," Harmon said without inflection, still typing. "Attorney. Already in the report." "What about him?" Supreme Court, Greer said. Harmon stopped typing. Not the sudden stop of someone surprised, but the gradual stop of someone who has heard something they need to process before they respond to it, like a machine receiving an input that does not match any of its existing categories. He looked at her. She was still holding her phone. The screen was still showing the SCOTUS page. He took the phone. He looked at it for a long time. He put it on the desk and pushed it gently away from him, the specific gesture of someone putting distance between themselves and an object that has become dangerous. He looked at the report he had signed 40 minutes ago with his signature in the approval line and the notation "good work" in his own handwriting. He began thinking through the coverage options with the methodical efficiency of a man who has navigated internal investigations before, who has a sense of which moves are available in which situations. He thought about calling the union. He thought about getting in front of the media narrative. He thought about the possible existence of alternative footage or the deniability of radio transmissions. Every option ran into the same walls. 3 news cameras, Reeves's body cam, Marcus's phone, 43 citizen videos, and a police radio system that logged every transmission automatically to a server that existed outside his control. There was no combination of available moves that produced a good outcome. He was looking at the board and seeing only end states. The precinct-wide radio crackled. "All units be advised. Federal agents en route to Addison Precinct. Estimated arrival 20 minutes. Greer heard it from the hallway. She had started walking toward Harmon's office and then stopped walking when the radio spoke, and when it finished, she continued standing in the hallway perfectly still while the sound of the transmission settled into the air and became part of the evening. In holding cell 3, Marcus Webb heard the same transmission. He checked the clock on the wall. He stood up from the bench and smoothed the front of his jacket, a gesture that was partly habit and partly the act of a man reclaiming the version of himself that had been made smaller by a steel bench and fluorescent light and 6 hours of institutional cold. He straightened his tie. He checked that the lapels were even. He was ready. The 4 vehicles pulled into the precinct lot at 8:48 p.m. and parked in a diagonal line that was not accidental, the way nothing about the arrival of a federal response team is accidental. They were black SUVs with government plates, and the small circular seal of the Department of Justice on both front doors. And when the doors opened, the 4 agents who stepped out moved with the particular economy of people who have rehearsed exactly this kind of entry in exactly this kind of situation and have no interest in theater. The lead agent was Dana Stokes, who was 44 years old and had the lean, precise quality of someone who runs on efficiency the way some people run on caffeine. Everything stripped to what matters, nothing retained that serves no function. She wore a dark suit and carried a credentials case and walked through the precinct entrance at a pace that said she knew exactly where she was going, even though she had never been in this building before. She identified herself to the desk sergeant and produced her credentials and said in the tone of someone stating a self-evident fact rather than opening a negotiation that she needed to speak with the commanding officer of the precinct immediately regarding the arrest of Marcus Webb. The desk sergeant, who was a practical man, picked up the phone. Harmon appeared 2 minutes later, still trying to arrange his expression into something that communicated confused cooperation, rather than the reality of what was happening behind it, which was controlled. Panic assembling itself into a defensive formation. He looked at Stokes and her colleagues and said in the voice of someone establishing that this is all a misunderstanding, that the Marcus Webb matter was a local incident, a simple arrest, a routine outcome of a protest situation, that he was not sure why federal resources were being directed at something so straightforward. Stokes waited for him to finish. Then she said, "You have Supreme Court Justice Marcus Webb in your holding cell. We need access to all footage, all evidence, and all documentation related to his arrest and processing. We need it now, and we need the arresting officer and the commanding officer made available for immediate interview." The words Supreme Court Justice moved through the precinct the way a power surge moves through wiring, not all at once and not loudly, but touching everything it passed through in a way that changed it. The desk sergeant, who had been reaching for a second pen, went still. An officer passing behind Harmon in the corridor stopped walking. From 3 rooms away, behind a closed door, a phone that had been mid-ring went silent, as though the person on the other end had also just heard something that required the line to stay open. And somewhere down the hall in the break room where she had been sitting in the spilled coffee and the broken ceramic, Sandra Greer heard the phrase come through the wall as clearly as if Stokes had said it directly to her, and her breath went out of her in a single controlled exhale that she did not allow to become anything louder. Harmon's response was a sound rather than a word, then a word which was what delivered in the hollow way of someone whose blood pressure has just registered a dramatic shift. Stokes was already moving toward the holding cells. A precinct officer reading the room accurately led her there without being told to. The door to cell 3 opened, and Stokes stepped into the doorway and looked at Marcus Webb sitting on the metal bench in his navy suit, with the bruise forming on his left cheekbone, and his hands folded in his lap and his back straight. "Justice Webb," she said, and her voice shifted slightly from the precise professional register she had been using with everyone else, not to warmth exactly, but to something that acknowledged the specific gravity of what she was looking at. "Are you injured? Do you require medical attention?" "I'm fine," Marcus said. "Thank you for coming." He said this without sarcasm and without performance. He was simply a man who had been in a place for a specified period and was acknowledging the arrival of the people whose arrival had always been a matter of time rather than question. He stood and walked out of the cell, and Stokes noted professionally and personally the bruise on his face and wrote a single line in her small notebook. "Visible injury consistent with impact will document fully." Interview room 2 was smaller than Harmon's office and had no windows and chairs that had been bolted to the floor at some point in the institutional past and never unbolted. The table was metal. The walls were cinder block painted the same beige as every other surface in the building, and the room smelled of old coffee and the particular staleness that comes from air that has been breathed by too many people over too many years without adequate circulation. Stokes placed her laptop on the table and sat across from Sandra Greer, who had been brought from the break room. and who sat with the posture of someone who is trying to appear cooperative, while every instinct she possesses is oriented toward the door. Greer's hands were on the table, visible, which was itself a tell she had placed them there intentionally, the way you place things intentionally when you are conscious of every physical signal your body is sending. On the table in front of Greer, her right hand rested with the fingers slightly spread, and even now in this room, with no baton available and no badge on her chest, the thumb moved in that small back-and-forth motion along the edge of the table, the habit looking for its instrument and finding only wood. Stokes opened the laptop and turned it to face Greer and pressed play. The audio was, as the forensic specialist would later say in court, exceptionally clear. Harmon's voice came out of the laptop speaker. "Handle it. We cannot let civilians think they own the street out here today. Not with the cameras running." Then Greer's voice, a single compressed word. "Copy." Then 11 seconds of ambient sound, crowd noise, and radio static, and the particular quality of outdoor summer air in a microphone. Then the sound of impact. Stokes did not pause the recording immediately. She let it run for another 30 seconds, capturing Greer's announcement and the arrest and the follow-up radio traffic. Then she stopped it. She did not speak. She let the silence work, because silence in a small room after a recording is a kind of pressure that requires no application. The word copy was still in the air. Greer could hear it the way you hear something that has been recorded rather than spoken, with a flatness that removes all the context and intention you would use to soften the meaning, leaving only the meaning itself. She heard her own voice agreeing to do what the tape proved she had done. She heard the 11 seconds. She heard the sound, and she felt moving through her unbidden, the same involuntary replay that had dropped her coffee cup in the break room. The arc of her hand, the sound of contact, the way his head had moved and then come back, and the look on his face that she now understood was not shock or pain, but recognition. The recognition of someone watching a familiar thing happen for reasons that were larger than the moment. Her breathing changed. The thumb on the table edge slowed and then stopped. "Your report," Stokes said, "finally states that Justice Webb became aggressive and that you responded with necessary force in self-defense." Greer said nothing. The footage Stokes continued shows him standing still with his hands at his sides for the entire duration of your approach. His GPS data extracted from the phone your officers bagged as evidence confirms that he did not move from his initial position at any point during the encounter. Stokes opened a second file and played a different audio clip. This one was from Marcus's phone, the recording he had started when he left his car and had been running continuously. Greer's voice came out of the speaker clear and unhurried, caught by the phone's microphone 40 feet away in the precinct parking bay. "People out there only understand one language. When you are working crowd control, you make sure they hear it." Stokes stopped the recording. She looked at Greer and let the silence do the work that no question could do more efficiently. In the adjacent room, Harmon had been sitting across from two of Stokes's colleagues for 20 minutes. They had played him his own radio transmission. They had played it twice. The second time they watched his face, and what they saw was a man listening to himself. The way you cannot listen to yourself in the moment of speaking without the buffer of intention, without the ability to hear what you meant rather than what you said. "Handle it. We cannot let civilians think they own the street." One of the agents slid a printed transcript across the table, time-stamped, authenticated, logged automatically by the police radio system at the time of transmission before anyone knew who Marcus Webb was. Harmon looked at it. He looked at the wall behind the agent's shoulder, and then in the particular silence of a man who has run through all the available positions and found none of them workable, he said. The sentence that ended his career and saved whatever remained of his future. "I will tell you everything I know about Greer's prior conduct," he said. "All 4 complaints. What I was asked to do with them. Who asked me. I want my cooperation documented from this moment." One of the agents uncapped a pen. Across the precinct, Greer did not know this yet. She was still in interview room 2 with her hands on the metal table and her thumb no longer moving, sitting in the silence that Stokes had created, and that the evidence was filling one layer at a time. Reeves came in voluntarily at that point, identified himself by name and badge number, and said in the careful voice of someone who has rehearsed this sentence that he had additional body cam footage, that he had secured backup copies, and that he was prepared to turn everything over. Stokes told him that he would need to give a formal statement and that she was granting him whistleblower status, effective immediately. Reeves nodded. His hands, he noticed, had stopped shaking. The corridor between the interview rooms and the main precinct floor was approximately 40 feet long and had the particular layered quality of walls that have been painted over themselves many times without ever being stripped, each coat trapping the one beneath it. The institutional history of the building held in the thickness of the paint. Marcus walked out of the holding cell wing into this corridor with Agent Stokes at his side, not as an escort exactly, but as an acknowledgement that he was no longer a man being processed, but a man being accompanied, which is a different quality of presence. At the other end of the corridor, a door opened. Sandra Greer came through it, flanked by 2 of Stokes's colleagues. She was no longer in full uniform. Her badge and service weapon had been collected in the interview room, and without them, her uniform looked slightly incomplete, the way a sentence looks when a word has been removed from the middle. She walked with the diminished momentum of someone who has had the forward drive taken out of them, not slowly, but without direction. The walking of someone being moved rather than moving. She saw Marcus. There was a distance of approximately 25 feet between them at the moment of recognition, and both parties came to a stop that was not quite simultaneous. Greer fractionally before Marcus, which meant that he had one more step of momentum when she stopped, and so his stop was the deliberate one, the chosen one. She wanted to speak. The wanting was visible in the slight opening of her jaw, the breath she drew. There was something she wanted to say, and it was not a defense or an explanation, because there was nothing in her face that suggested she thought either of those things would work. It was something closer to the impulse toward acknowledgement, the need to be seen by the person you have wronged as someone who understands the wrongness of what they have done. But understanding the wrongness of what you have done is not the same as deserving to be heard about it, and the corridor held 20 feet of that distinction between them. Marcus looked at her. His expression was the one that those who had watched him on the bench over 2 years described as his reading expression, the expression of a man processing information, extracting what is relevant, setting aside what is not. It was not cold, and it was not forgiving. It was the expression that holds space for both possibility and consequence simultaneously, that allows for the full weight of a moment without collapsing under it. He held the look for 3 seconds. Then he continued walking. The precinct's main doors were ahead. Beyond them, the audio was already audible through the glass, the sound of a crowd that had returned. When the news broke, the sound of cameras and chants and the ambient energy of a large number of people gathered around something they believe matters. Marcus pushed through the doors, and the cameras found him instantly, the flashes overlapping until the light was continuous rather than intermittent. He raised one hand, palm out, and the crowd quieted with a speed that suggested they had been waiting for exactly this, for something from him, for the word or gesture that would tell them what this meant. "Justice will run its course," he said. He said it simply without amplification, and somehow the crowd caught it and passed it backward, and the quieting rippled outward, through proper channels, through the system. That was all he gave them. Behind him, through the precinct doors, Sandra Greer heard the sound of the crowd's response, which was not a cheer exactly, but a wave, the collective release of people who have been holding something. She heard it through the glass, and she did not look toward it, and the agent at her elbow guided her in the other direction, away from the doors toward the administrative processing area, where the next formal steps of her official end were waiting. The CNN broadcast broke at 10:23 p.m. Eastern, which meant it was the lead story on the 11 o'clock news on every major network in the country, which meant that the morning shows were already restructuring their rundowns before midnight, and the newspaper editorial teams were rewriting their front pages, and the 24-hour cable cycle had found the story it was going to run with for the next 72 hours, which was longer than most stories lasted, but shorter than this one would. The split screen that CNN used first was the one that went viral fastest. Left side. The protest video. Greer's hand rising and Marcus's head snapping sideways, the image frozen at the moment of contact. Right side. His official SCOTUS portrait. The same face, the same calm, that in the protest video read as remarkable composure, and in the official photograph read as the composure of someone accustomed to the longest stakes imaginable. The contrast between the two images was not subtle and was not intended to be. It was the visual equivalent of a statement of fact. The Department of Justice released its first evidence package at 11:15 p.m. The package contained three things: the synchronized broadcast footage from all three news cameras, Reeves's body cam footage with the audio enhanced and time-stamped, and the GPS and accelerometer data from Marcus's phone. The synchronized broadcast footage showed the same moment from three different angles simultaneously, and the effect of seeing it that way was qualitatively different from seeing any single angle alone. From the left camera, you saw Greer's full body as she approached. From the center camera, you saw Marcus's face, his stillness, the absence of any movement toward her. From the right camera, you saw the arc of the hand. Together, the three angles created a three-dimensional account of the event that was essentially impossible to dispute on the question of what had physically occurred. Reeves's body cam audio enhanced by the DOJ's forensic audio unit was devastating in its clarity. Harmon's voice was recognizable and unambiguous. The word "copy Greer's response" lasted 0.4 seconds and was followed by 11 seconds of ambient sound and then the impact. The 11-second gap was not incidental. It was the evidence of premeditation of a decision made and executed of a cause preceding its effect in a way that could be sequenced and time-stamped and presented to any jury in any jurisdiction in the country. The GPS data from Marcus's phone was a kind of poetry of fact, a single coordinate point stationary held for the entire duration of the confrontation. The dot on the map that did not move while the event that would be discussed for years moved around it. At midnight, the DOJ released the second package, Marcus's own phone audio, including Greer's voice in the parking bay, and the synchronized transcript of all radio transmissions from the protest operation with timestamps. At 12:40, a clip appeared on social media that had been filmed by a journalism student named Bethany Proct, who had been standing in the hallway outside the break room when she heard the sound of ceramic breaking, and who had on instinct pointed her phone toward the doorway and captured the moment Greer standing in the middle of the break room floor, phone in her hand, face draining to a color that had no warm component. The coffee spreading outward from the shattered cup, and two quiet words coming from her mouth said twice. That clip reached 10 million views in 4 hours. The hashtag around it was the one that named the emotion everyone watching recognized the moment you realize. By 1 a.m., Greer's personnel file had been obtained by 3 news organizations through sources that were not identified and did not need to be identified because the document's content was verifiable through the public record of settled civil complaints. 4 prior complaints, all from black men, all reviewed and closed by Captain Harmon without investigation. The settlements paid with taxpayer money over 11 years totaled $340,000, which was a fact that the news organizations put into their graphics with specific numbers because specific numbers are harder to look away from than general ones. Legal analysts appeared on cable television to discuss the specific ruling that Marcus had authored 6 months before his arrest, the one that eliminated qualified immunity in cases of filmed misconduct. The irony of the situation was discussed on television by 12 different analysts in the space of 3 hours, and each of them described it differently, but arrived at the same observation: Sandra Greer had violated the specific legal precedent written by the specific person she had violated it against. She had assaulted the author of the law under which she was now exposed. The formal federal charges were filed 72 hours after the arrest, which was faster than most federal charging decisions move, and was a reflection of the completeness of the evidence, rather than any departure from normal process. Because when the evidence is complete, the process can be complete, and in this case the evidence was as complete as evidence gets. United States versus Sandra Greer. 5 counts: assault under color of law, false arrest, deprivation of civil rights, conspiracy to violate civil rights, filing false police reports. Each count carrying a sentencing range of 5 to 10 years. The prosecution in its filing stated its intention to request consecutive, rather than concurrent sentences at the time of sentencing, which meant that if the maximum were applied across all counts, Greer was facing exposure measured in decades rather than years. United States versus William Harmon. 3 counts: obstruction of justice, conspiracy to violate civil rights, abuse of authority. Harmon's badge had been surrendered the night of the federal arrival. His pension, which had been accumulating for 28 years and was projected at $84,000 per year, was immediately frozen pending the outcome of the criminal proceedings. The police union issued a statement at 9 a.m. on the day the charges were filed, and the statement contained a sentence that 12 years of Greer's career had not prepared her to read the Millhaven Police Benevolent Association does not provide legal defense for actions determined to fall egregiously outside the lawful scope of an officer's duties, and based on the available evidence, the association has concluded that Officer Greer's actions in this matter meet that standard. Greer read the statement in a conference room on the 3rd floor of the precinct where she was waiting for the administrative processing of her termination to be completed, and the reading of it had the effect that the removal of the last available structural support, as when a structure has been depending on it, things that had been held up came down. The civil lawsuit filed simultaneously by Marcus's legal team was targeted with a specificity that reflected both the legal precedent and the deliberate removal of the city's indemnification cover. The city would not be paying. The suit was against Greer and Harmon personally, and the amount sought was $2,800,000, and the assets available to satisfy it were per the filing subject to full civil seizure, including residential property, retirement accounts, and personal savings. 3 names appeared in the DOJ's supporting documentation for the charging decision names that had been in Greer's personnel file in the complaint records, names that had been filed and closed and settled and silenced over the previous 11 years. James Tatum, Robert Slade, Darius Price. All 3 men had been contacted by DOJ investigators. All 3 had agreed to testify. All 3 had stories that were in the specific language of the charging document, substantially similar in method and motivation to the events of the current case, which was the legal way of saying that what happened to Marcus Webb had happened to them first, and without the cameras, and without the credential, and without the outcome. Kyle Reeves was promoted 3 weeks after the charges were filed. His new assignment was the Internal Affairs Reform Unit. His body cam footage became the training standard. The department produced a training video built around his footage, and the video was titled simply, "This is what integrity looks like." The police accountability ordinance that had been stalled in the city council for 9 months came to a vote 3 weeks after the arrest. It passed unanimously. The precinct was placed under a federal consent decree. 5 years of mandatory federal oversight, new body camera protocols requiring continuous recording, new use of force training, new complaint review procedures that bypassed the internal chain of command entirely when the complaint involved an officer above a certain rank. 4 months after the arrest, the air inside Federal Courtroom 4B of the Millhaven Federal Building had the quality that federal courtrooms always have, which is the quality of a space where seriousness has been maintained for long enough that it has become architectural, as though it is part of the walls rather than an attitude brought in by the people occupying them. The ceiling was high. The dark wood of the bench and the gallery rails held the particular smell of furniture polish and old authority. The air was cool and carried the faint formality of a room where the heaviest things are decided, and the federal seal behind the judge's bench did not need to announce its presence because its presence was self-evident. Sandra Greer sat at the defense table in a charcoal suit that had been purchased for this occasion and did not fit her in the way that clothing purchased for an occasion does not fit. which is to say it was the right size but the wrong shape for the person wearing it, because the person wearing it had lost 14 pounds in 4 months, and the clothing had been purchased for the person she was before. She sat with her hands in her lap, and her back not quite straight, the slight forward curve of someone who has been compressing themselves for a long time. Harmon was not there. He had taken a plea deal 8 weeks before the trial, agreeing to 3 years in federal prison and full cooperation with the prosecution, which meant testifying against Greer in exchange for the reduced sentence. The blue wall, that structure that had been the load-bearing element of Greer's understanding of how her professional life worked, had completed its collapse with Harmon's signature on the cooperation agreement. In the front row of the gallery, 3 men sat in a row that was not coincidental. James Tatum, 54, who had his complaint filed and closed in the 4th year of Greer's career. Robert Slade, 49, whose complaint had been filed and settled and sealed by a non-disclosure agreement that the DOJ had since rendered void. Darius Price, 61, the oldest of the 3 who had filed his complaint 7 years ago and been dismissed, and who had spent 7 years with the knowledge of what had happened to him, living in him like a stone he could not put down. These 3 men had not been famous. Nobody had filmed them. Their names had not trended on Twitter, and their stories had not broken on CNN. They had been in the way of many people who experience injustice without the specific combination of circumstance that brings it to public attention, simply people who knew something had happened to them and had not been believed when they said so. They were in the front row today because they would be believed today. That was not enough. It was not what they deserved. But it was what was now available to them. And they had come. Judge Eleanor Strand entered at 9 a.m. precisely. She was 63 years old, had been on the federal bench for 20 years, and had the particular quality of gravity that comes from 2 decades of presiding over rooms where the heaviest things are decided. She did not need to use her gavel to establish order. The order established itself when she sat down. The prosecution played the synchronized footage before calling its first witness. The 3-camera evidence package was displayed on a monitor facing the jury. 8 jurors. 7 of them watched the footage in complete stillness. 1 covered her mouth with her hand about 4 seconds in. None of them looked at Greer during the playback. When the footage ended, the silence in the room had a different texture than the silence before it. Marcus Webb took the stand on the 3rd day of the trial. He was wearing his service uniform, not his SCOTUS robe, because a court appearance as a witness is not a judicial function and requires civilian attire. And he wore his civilian attire with the same quality of presence he brought to everything, which was the presence of a man who has carried himself the same way for long enough that the carrying is invisible, indistinguishable from the way he simply is. He sat in the witness chair and adjusted the microphone without being asked, and looked at the prosecution attorney with the patient attention of someone prepared to be accurate and thorough. The prosecution's questions were methodical. Marcus's answers were precise in the way that 30 years of legal practice produces precision, not the precision of compression, but of completeness, the right amount of detail, the right sequence, the right framing. He described the confrontation without drama or embellishment, and the absence of drama made every word heavier rather than lighter. Then the defense stood for cross-examination. Greer's attorney was a 48-year-old public defender named Carl Whitmore, who had been assigned to the case when Greer's private counsel withdrew, and who was competent and tired and doing the best he could, with a hand that offered very little. He approached the podium, arranged his papers, and looked at Marcus. "Justice Webb," he said, "is it not true that you had the ability at any point during your encounter with Officer Greer to identify yourself by name and title and thereby end the confrontation?" "Yes," Marcus said, "and you chose not to do so." "I did. Could you explain to the court why you made that choice?" The courtroom was very quiet. Not the waiting quiet of an audience anticipating entertainment, but the specific quiet of a room where people understand that the next words are going to mean something. Marcus looked at Whitmore for a moment. Then his gaze moved across the gallery, and it came to rest on the front row where James Tatum and Robert Slade and Darius Price were sitting. James Tatum identified himself, Marcus said. He gave his name and his address and his occupation and his reason for being on the street where Officer Greer stopped him 3 times. And she filed a complaint against him anyway, and the complaint was dismissed. The room did not move. Robert Slade had his hands visible and his registration ready before he was asked. He had done everything correctly, every step of every protocol, and he still ended up with a complaint against him and a settlement that required him to sign a document saying he would not speak about what had happened to him. Darius Price was sitting in his own driveway. Marcus let that land. "A title should not be what saves you," he said. "The law should be what saves you." I went to that sidewalk to document what happens when the law is not protecting people the way it is supposed to protect them. I did not need to document it for long. It presented itself very efficiently. Whitmore stood at the podium for a moment after Marcus finished speaking. He looked at his notes. He looked at the jury. He looked at the gallery where James Tatum and Robert Slade and Darius Price were sitting, and where something in the air of the room had shifted into a territory that his cross-examination had not intended to reach. "No further questions," he said. The jury deliberated for 74 minutes, which the legal observers in the gallery later discussed at some length because 74 minutes for a 5-count federal case is on the shorter end of the scale, and the general interpretation was that the deliberation time reflected not speed or carelessness, but the completeness of the evidence, the degree to which the jury had entered deliberation, already knowing what they found and needing only to be precise about saying so. The foreman read the verdict in a flat, deliberate voice that treated each count as its own sentence. Guilty, 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 guilty. Each one fell into the room with the weight of something that had been held in potential for a long time and was now resolved. Greer sat with her hands folded on the defense table and received each count with the same small, almost invisible nod. The nod of someone who has been waiting for a thing and is acknowledging its arrival. Judge Strand sentenced 3 days later. She looked at Greer over the bench with the expression of someone who has decided not to perform gravity because gravity is inherent in the moment and does not require performance. "Officer Greer," she began, and the use of the title was deliberate, and its deletion of the context around it was also deliberate. The economy of someone making a point by subtraction. "You stood on a public sidewalk with a badge and a baton and the full authority of the state behind you, and you chose to use all of it to silence a man who was exercising the most fundamental right this country recognizes. You told your partner before you ever approached him that people only understand one language and that your job was to make sure they heard it. This court has heard your language, Officer Greer. It heard it on 4 separate recordings. It heard it in the testimony of 3 men whose complaints you filed away and whose silence you bought with taxpayer money. The language you believed in is the language of force without accountability, of power without consequence. And I want you to understand before this sentence is read that this court speaks a different language entirely." She paused. The courtroom was completely still. "On counts 1 through 5, I sentence you to 9 years in federal correctional custody to be served consecutively rather than concurrently in recognition of the premeditated and patterned nature of the conduct. You are not eligible for early parole consideration, given the evidence of prior similar conduct documented in your personnel file and corroborated by the testimony of this trial." She set down the sentencing sheet. "Your municipal pension, which has accumulated $234,000 over your 11 years of service, is forfeited in full. Those funds will be distributed in equal portions of $78,000 each to James Tatum, Robert Slade, and Darius Price. The 3 individuals identified in the DOJ's investigation as victims of substantially similar conduct during your time on the force. You are permanently barred from employment in any law enforcement capacity in any jurisdiction." The civil judgment entered simultaneously was $2,800,000 secured against Greer's residential property retirement savings and personal accounts. The marshals came for her. She stood. She walked between them toward the door at the back of the courtroom with the particular walk of someone who has become physically smaller than they were 4 months ago and has not yet made peace with that reduction. The door closed behind her. In the front row, James Tatum sat very still for a moment after the door closed. Then he put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor, and his shoulders moved once a single involuntary motion before he brought himself back to stillness. Marcus was not in this gallery. He had watched the verdict from his chambers, a live stream on his laptop screen, and when the foreman finished, he had closed the laptop and looked out the window at the federal district's skyline for a long time without moving. And what he had felt was not satisfaction, because satisfaction implies that the outcome has resolved something. And what he understood with complete clarity was that the outcome had resolved the case and had not resolved the condition that made the case possible, and those were not the same thing, and any feeling that confused them would be a mistake in his analysis. And Marcus Webb did not permit himself analytical mistakes as a matter of professional practice. He turned from the window and opened the next file on his desk. Nathan Webb was 13 years old when he stood in front of his 8th grade civics class and gave a presentation that his teacher, a woman named Carolyn Marsh, who had been teaching for 22 years and thought she had seen most of what a student presentation could be later described as the thing she would remember most about her career. He had titled it with the directness of a 13-year-old who has not yet learned to soften a statement for the benefit of the audience. The day my grandpa taught me about real justice. He did not begin with his grandfather. He began with James Tatum. He described as clearly as a 13-year-old can describe something he has researched carefully and thought about at length what happened to James Tatum 7 years ago on a Tuesday afternoon that had probably also seemed unremarkable at the start. He described what James had done, identified himself, kept his hands visible, followed every protocol. He described what had happened anyway. He described Robert Slade in similar terms, and Darius Price, and he said their names 3 times each over the course of the presentation because he had decided that saying names was important, that names are the specific thing that gets taken away when a person is reduced to an incident. Then he talked about his grandfather. "My grandfather is a Supreme Court justice," he said, and his voice carried the particular pride of someone who is trying not to perform pride but cannot entirely suppress it. But he went to that protest the same way James Tatum went down his own street, without a title, without announcing himself, because he wanted to see what the system looks like when it thinks nobody important is watching. He paused. "He could have told her who he was in 5 seconds," Nathan said. "Anybody who knows him knows he thought about that option every minute of those 6 hours. He let it happen because he wanted me to understand something that you cannot understand from a textbook." He looked at his class with the directness of someone who has decided that what he is about to say matters more than whether it sounds good. "The lesson is not that my grandpa is brave," he said. "I mean, he is. But the lesson is that Officer Reeves is just as important to this story, because Officer Reeves was 26 years old with 8 months on the job, and he had every reason to close his laptop and look the other way, and he did not. And because he did not, the truth exists in a form that nobody can dispute. Without him, it is a Supreme Court justice's word against an officer's word, and we know how that math usually works." The room was very quiet. "Justice is not about power," Nathan said. "It is about people who are willing to tell the truth when the truth is inconvenient, and cameras, and evidence, and the courage to not look away." Caroline Marsh gave him an A and submitted the video of the presentation to the district's Education Excellence Review Board. The board shared it with the State Department of Education. The State Department shared it publicly. By the end of the month, it had been viewed by teachers in 43 states who were incorporating it into their curriculum plans for the following semester. Marcus saw it on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks after the verdict. His daughter sent him the link without comment. He watched it alone in his chambers with the door closed. When it ended, he sat for a while without moving, and then he picked up his phone and called Nathan. And when Nathan answered, Marcus said simply, "I am very proud of you." And Nathan said, "I know, Grandpa. I know. The apartment was on the east side of Millhaven on the fourth floor of a building that had been constructed in 1974 and had aged in the specific way of buildings that are maintained without being renovated clean and functional and honest about what they are. The kitchen smelled of fresh coffee and the faint lingering warmth of something baked earlier in the day, and through the single east-facing window, the last light of the September evening came in at a low angle that put everything in a gentle relief. The kitchen table was a round wooden one that had enough rings on its surface to date a certain number of years of coffee cups and evening meals, and there were 2 chairs at it and 2 cups of coffee on it, and 2 men who had come from very different starting points to the same location on a Thursday evening. Marcus Webb had taken the bus. He had specifically decided to take the bus not because he was making a point, but because it was the kind of decision he had been making more often lately. The decision to experience the city as most of its residents experienced it, and because the 40-minute bus ride had given him time to think about what he wanted to say and how he wanted to say it. Kyle Reeves had cleaned the apartment with the anxious thoroughness of someone who is about to receive a guest they want to impress, while also knowing that impressing the guest is not the point of the visit. He had made coffee and then worried it was not good enough, and then told himself that the quality of the coffee was genuinely not the issue here. Marcus arrived and they sat down, and Marcus said without preamble, because he was not a man who used preamble to manage discomfort, "I wanted to talk with you privately because what you did deserves to be acknowledged privately. Not as a symbol, not in a training video, not in a press release. As one person to another." Reeves held his coffee cup with both hands in the way of someone who needs something to hold. He said that he had only done what he became a cop to do. Marcus nodded. "That is the point," he said. "The doing of it was not complicated for you in the moral sense. It was complicated in every other sense, in the practical and professional and social sense, and you did it anyway. That is rarer than you might think. That is the specific thing that makes the difference between a system that corrects itself and a system that cannot." They sat with that for a moment. Reeves asked the question he had been carrying for 4 months. He asked it the way you ask things you have thought about long enough that asking them is a relief regardless of the answer. "Why did you not just tell her who you were?" he said. "You could have ended it in seconds, the whole thing." Marcus was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was forming an answer rather than reaching for one. "Because James Tatum told her who he was," he said. "He told her he was a citizen with rights, and a name, and a reason for being on a public street. And she arrested him anyway. The title should not be the thing that saves you. I needed to document what happens when the title is not there, because for most of the people who need that documentation, the title is never there." Reeves looked at his coffee. He nodded once slowly, the nod of someone for whom something has become clearer rather than simpler. They talked for another hour, and the conversation was not about law or procedure or the specific mechanics of what had happened. It was about what it means to work inside a structure that is capable of both profound failure and genuine correction, and about how people who understand both of those things at the same time decide what to do with that understanding. When Marcus left, Reeves stood in the kitchen for a while. He looked at his badge on the counter, the new one, the one for the Internal Affairs Reform Unit, and he picked it up and held it for a moment, and what he felt was not pride exactly, but something adjacent to it, the feeling of a responsibility that has been clarified. The SCOTUS building in the morning has a specific quality of light in October when the angle of the sun through the east-facing windows is low enough to move across the floors in a way that changes from room to room as the morning progresses, and Marcus had learned the sequence of it in 2 years and found it, though he would not have used this word in a legal brief, beautiful. He came in early on the morning after the verdict and took his case files from the desk where he had left them the previous evening and sat down. His colleague, Justice Patricia Mendez, stopped by his chambers at 9:30. She was 59 and had the particular directness of someone who decided long ago that life is too short for circumlocution. "Are you okay?" she said. And then before he could answer with anything general, she added, "Really?" Marcus thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. The institution worked, he said. Not because of who I am, because a rookie officer kept his camera running when his partner told him to turn it off. Because 3 men who had been dismissed and silenced for years were still willing to stand up and be counted. Because the evidence was preserved and the process was allowed to function the way it is designed to function when people inside it choose to honor the design rather than circumvent it. You could have avoided all of it, Mendez said. That was not the point, Marcus said. And he said it without elaboration, because the elaboration had been given in full in a federal courtroom to a jury that understood it and did not need to be repeated here. Mendez nodded and left. Marcus turned back to his desk. The file open in front of him was a case from a city 400 miles north, a case that concerned police conduct and the use of surveillance technology and the question of when oversight is required and who gets to decide. He read the opening brief with the careful attention he brought to everything, making notes in the margin in the small, precise handwriting that 30 years had not changed. The morning light moved across the floor. The case was real, and it was immediate, and there were people whose lives would be shaped by how it was decided. People who were not Marcus Webb and did not have Marcus Webb's title or resources or network of professional relationships. People who were simply citizens, hoping that the institution would see them clearly when it looked. He turned to the next page and kept reading. James Tatum was 54 years old and had worked for the same plumbing company for 19 years, first as an apprentice and then as a journeyman, and then as a senior technician with his own route and his own clients. He had a house that was almost paid off and a wife named Gloria and 2 adult children, and a particular way of sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings, with his hands wrapped around his coffee cup that had not changed in the years his wife had known him. Except that for 7 of those years there had been something underneath the stillness, a held quality like someone maintaining a posture against pressure. The check arrived on a Tuesday. $78,000. The letter from the Department of Justice was formal and thorough, explaining the provenance of the funds. The forfeiture from Greer's pension, the court order directing distribution, the void of the non-disclosure agreement that had required his silence. James and Gloria sat at the kitchen table with the check between them and did not speak for a moment. "It is not what I wanted," James said finally. He was not looking at the check. He was looking at the middle distance that people look at when they are trying to see through the present moment to something behind it. What I wanted was for them to believe me the first time. What I wanted was for it not to have happened. Gloria reached across the table and put her hand over his. "But they believe you now," she said. James looked at the check. He nodded slowly, a single movement that was not agreement exactly, but acknowledgement, the acknowledgement of something that is not what you wanted, but is what is available and is in the space of all possible outcomes real. "Yeah," he said. "Now." Robert Slade was 49 and lived in a rental apartment that was smaller than the house he had been unable to keep after the financial toll of the dismissed complaint and the legal fees and the years when the thing he could not talk about because of the settlement agreement had cost him energy he would have otherwise spent on other things. He used his share of the funds to retire the debt, and when the last payment was confirmed, he sat in his apartment on a Saturday morning and called his son, who was 22, and lived in another city, and had grown up knowing something had happened to his father without knowing exactly what, because the agreement had required that too. "Dad," his son said when Robert told him what the call was for, "is it really over?" Robert looked out the window at the courtyard of his building where a kid was riding a bicycle in slow circles. "It is over," he said. His son was quiet for a moment, and then said something that Robert had not expected, which was simply, "Tell me what happened. Tell me all of it." And Robert, for the first time in 7 years, did. Darius Price was 61 years old, the oldest of the 3, and he had spent 7 years carrying his experience with a patience that had required, as he would tell his daughter, a very specific kind of faith. Not faith that the institution would correct itself necessarily, but faith that bearing witness accurately and consistently is its own kind of work, and that its value is not always visible in the moment of the bearing. His daughter was 19 and had just completed her first year at a community college where she was studying pre-law. When the letter came and the check came and Darius told her what the plan was for his portion of the funds, she looked at him and said nothing for a long moment. The plan was to pay her tuition, not just this year. The full 4 years of a law program at the state university she had been accepted to, but could not attend because the cost was beyond what they could reach. "She is going to know the law better than any officer who ever came near us," Darius said, not to his daughter directly, but to the room, to the space between them where the years of what had happened lived. His daughter stepped forward and put her arms around him, and she held on, and Darius put his hand on the back of her head the way he had when she was small, and they stood like that in the kitchen of the house where she had grown up until she was ready to let go. These 3 men were not the center of any news cycle by the time their restitution arrived. The cameras had moved on. The hashtags had dissolved into the general flow. Their names appeared in the DOJ's final case summary in a footnote, which is where the law puts the specific humans when it is organizing a general principle. But the footnote is still the record. The names are still there in the permanent federal archive, attributed accurately to what they experienced and what they were owed. Marcus Webb did not know the specific details of what happened in James Tatum's kitchen, or what Robert Slade said to his son on the phone, or how Darius Price's daughter held on to him. Nobody called him to report these things. They were not his story to be told, but they were the reason he had stood on a sidewalk and not moved. Sandra Greer was 4 months into a 9-year federal sentence at a correctional facility in eastern Ohio when the television mounted on the wall of the laundry room where she worked showed the signing ceremony. She was folding a sheet, and the motion of her hands stopped when she saw the chyron running beneath the footage of the ceremony. President signs Webb Tatum Police Accountability Act into federal law, named for Marcus Webb and James Tatum. The camera held on the signing table for a moment, showing the officials arranged behind the president, and Greer recognized one face among them, and then the camera cut to something else, and Greer looked at the sheet in her hands and finished folding it and placed it on the pile and reached for the next one. The Webb-Tatum Act required continuous body camera recording for all law enforcement contacts with civilians in departments receiving federal funding, eliminated qualified immunity protections for officers caught on camera, committing misconduct, and established a federal oversight panel with independent authority to review departments demonstrating a pattern of civil rights violations. 34 states had signed on within 6 months of the federal passage. The implementation affected 2.3 million officers and an uncounted number of Americans who would encounter those officers on sidewalks and in traffic stops and in the ordinary moments of daily life where the distance between dignity and its absence is sometimes measured in whether a camera is running. On a Wednesday evening in October, Marcus Webb was at his desk in his SCOTUS chambers when his phone showed a message from Nathan. It was a voice memo rather than a text, which was Nathan's preference, and Marcus put in his earbuds and listened. His grandson's voice, now carrying the first registers of the lower range that 13-year-old voices start to reach for, said Grandpa. "They want us to come to the state education conference next month. Both of us. They said our story should be heard in person. Let me know." Marcus typed his reply in a single sentence. "It was never just our story, Nathan." Then he set the phone down and looked out the window at the city in the October light, and then he picked up the file on his desk and opened it to the page he had marked and turned on his reading lamp and bent his attention to the work that was in front of him, which was the work of a man who has not finished, who will not be finished, who understands that the finished state is not one that justice reaches, but one that it moves toward day by day, case by case, one careful and honest word at a time. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of something important about dignity, about the people whose names we never knew until someone finally said them out loud, please take a moment right now and hit that like button. It costs you nothing, and it helps more people find stories like this one. And if you want to be here when the next story drops, subscribe to our channel and turn on the bell so you never miss it. Share this one with someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you for watching, and thank you for caring enough to stay until the end.